So we're going to transition to our first panel on net zero. And again, thank Doreen for her leadership and all the work that NYSERDA is doing. So now on net zero, our first big trend that we're going to dive into. You know, net zero has become this buzzword. Some people understand it, some people don't understand it. There hasn't been a lot of uniformity when it comes to net zero, and frankly, there's been some greenwashing when it comes to net zero with no oversight. And so regulations are changing in this space quickly. They've been changing in Europe quickly, and more to come here in the United States. But clearly what we see is there's a right way to do net zero, and there's a wrong way to do net zero. And we've got to find the right way to do it. Because at the end of the day, the Paris Climate Accord is a net zero accord, right? What Paris said is we have to have our climate emissions by 2030, then have them again by 2050, and what's ever left from an emission standpoint in 2050, we have to take out of the air. Well, guess what? That's the net part. It is a net zero regime. So if you support the Paris Climate Accord, you support net zero, which is why we've got to get it right here. So our first panel is going to dive into that. It's going to be moderated by Recalde, who's the Senior Director for ESG at Carrier. But before Corey comes up with the full panel, we're first going to get grounded on what net zero is by one of the world's most authorities on it. That's the Science Based Targets Initiative. And we have Paulina Tarrant with us from the Science Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, to start that. So Paulina, please join us on the stage. Thank you.
All right, hello. Let me just make sure I can do this. Hi, and thank you for having me here today. And as you just mentioned, I'm with the Science Based Targets Initiative. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the organization, we are a global body that enables businesses to set ambitious reduction targets in line with the latest climate science. So the Science Based Targets Initiative was launched ahead of, as you just mentioned, the milestone Paris Agreement in 2015, with the goal of getting just 100 companies to commit to science-based targets. Today, over 1,000 companies representing over a third of the global economy have committed to decarbonizing in line with science through the SBTI. So science-based targets have really become the standard operating procedure for companies that are sincere in their climate commitments, and including the companies that are seeking to set credible net zero targets. Today, I'm going to walk you through what makes a net zero target, discuss some credible claims, and then also give you a really brief update on the Science Based Targets Initiative's building guidance that is currently under development. So what are we aiming for, and what is a credible net zero claim? The IPCC has clearly outlined that halving global emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050 is the best shot that we have at limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. In response, there has been a shift in the corporate sustainability space towards the concept of net zero, and the number of businesses has been really increasing in this space over the last few years. However, not all net zero targets are equal. So due to the lack of a globally accepted standard, companies began setting targets using many different approaches. And so to quote the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he said, "The problem is that the criteria and benchmarks for these net zero commitments have varying levels of rigor and loopholes wide enough to drive a diesel truck through." And so corporate net zero targets can play an absolutely critical role in addressing climate emergency, but without adhering to a common definition, net zero targets can be inconsistent and their collective impact can be limited. So that's why the SBTI released the net zero standard in October 2021. It's the world's first framework for corporate net zero target setting in line with climate science. Essentially what we've done is we've taken the global net zero scenario and broken it down by the company level. So it provided a lot of clarity on what net zero emissions reductions mean. And before I would like to kind of dive a little bit deeper into what makes a net zero target. And so there are a few key elements, 4 key elements of a net zero target. First, we have our near-term targets. And so this is your 5 to 10-year target to reduce emissions in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius. This aligns to the global goal of halving global emissions by 2030. And it holds companies accountable in the near term, making sure that we're driving the action that we need to see here today. Second, we have long-term science-based targets, and this shows companies how much they need to reduce their emissions to align with global net zero scenarios by 2050 at the latest. So for most companies, this will actually be at least 90% or more. These targets are really important to help companies understand the absolute deep level of transformation that is going to be required to reach net zero. So third, we have beyond value chain mitigation. This is actually a recommendation from the Science Based Targets Initiative, and these are the mitigation actions that a company takes above and beyond the reductions within their own value chain and outside of their own scope 1, 2, and 3 footprints. Although this is not a requirement, SBTI really strongly encourages these activities on the route towards reaching the net zero target. And then fourth, we have neutralization. This is a commitment by companies to permanently remove and store any remaining emissions at the time when their long-term target is reached. So only once a company has really reached its long-term target and neutralized those remaining emissions is when a company can claim to have reached net zero. So by following essentially the net zero standard, a company can know that their targets are in line with that latest climate science. Of course, the actions will not always be the easiest, and we must learn to decipher between what might be a short-term solution and what has greater benefits to society in the long term through decarbonization. And so this is what makes a credible net zero claim. But there are a lot of other claims that companies are making, a lot of different terms like carbon neutral, carbon positive, negative, et cetera. And these claims, they all have varying definitions, as we heard earlier, and this leads to uncertainty. So it's really important for companies to make sure that they do not mislead consumers and stakeholders and make any false claims. At the core of that is really transparency. Companies should be as absolutely transparent as possible, laying out any uncertainties and developing plans to fill those gaps along the way. So it's really less about the claim and more about the substance that backs that up. So as I said, the standard provides a common and robust understanding of net zero. And one of the things that we incorporated and really addressed through the development of that standard were some key criticisms that had evolved over time through the evolution of net zero. And some of these criticisms include incomplete boundary. So this is a selective inclusion of the types of emission sources. For example, focusing just on carbon dioxide and leaving the other greenhouse gases behind. A lack of near-term action, so kicking the can down the line in terms of the actual mitigation activities, and a focus on offsetting instead of emission reductions, and also poor accountability. So the net zero standard is really a method of accountability here because often net zero gets casually tossed around as a way to deflect action until it's really too late. And then one other thing to note here is that science-based targets are really the minimum benchmark for climate action. They show that companies, they show the minimum percentage reduction to align with decarbonization pathways, which is why we say that companies should reduce by at least 90% to reach net zero. Companies that can aim for more should aim for more, and decarbonizing a value chain is increasingly becoming the minimum expectation. I also want to address the elephant in the room, which are carbon credits. A common misconception is that the SBTI condones carbon credits. Carbon credits can't be used to undermine genuine emission reduction efforts. They also cannot be used towards the actual emission reductions of a target. However, any additional investments that could help increase the likelihood of global communities staying within 1.5 degrees Celsius and within a 1.5C carbon budget is more than welcomed and very, very strongly encouraged. We need every tool in the toolbox. Businesses can play a critical role in accelerating the net zero transition and addressing the ecological crises beyond their own value chains. We want to incentivize and catalyze as much climate finance as possible from the private sector. And first and foremost, that's through the science-based targets to make sure companies deploy finance to decarbonize their businesses, but also by strongly recommending that businesses go above and beyond to finance mitigation outside of their own value chains. And so if we're going to be reaching societal net zero, we need the private sector to decarbonize and invest in nature-based solutions like tropical forests and peatlands. And so that's something that the SBTI is also doing. In addition to the recommendations that we've done through the standard here, is we're currently developing and engaging with stakeholders to provide more detail on beyond value chain mitigation. The SBTI also develops sector-specific guidance for the highest emitting industries. We're here today to talk about the built environment, and the SBTI is currently developing guidance for the building sector. So today, as you're all aware, the built environment is a major contributor of emissions globally. At the same time, global floor area is projected to significantly increase until 2050. Climate change, as we all see quite visibly in the past few days, is already affecting the industry, causing physical and damage and risk. And what our buildings guidance will do is provide an indication of how much and by when an individual company should reduce their emissions from its operations to be in line with the carbon budget. SBTs are also different to asset level standards, certification schemes, and assessments. Those are a complementary tool for designing and managing buildings in a sustainable way, whereas SBTs are at the company level. Just quickly, there are three main objectives of our buildings project. One, to develop granular 1.5 degrees Celsius aligned pathways for in-use emissions of global building sector. This was published in January of this year. And then second, to create global 1.5 C aligned pathways for embodied emissions of new construct buildings. And third, issue guidance for emission accounting, reporting, and target setting for all stakeholders within the sector. The project kicked off already at the end of 2021. We're expecting to finalize these materials by the end of this year. The guidance is actually under public consultation at the moment. I highly encourage any of you to provide your input. We really value your valuable feedback by submitting through the details here that you can see on the screen on our website by July 16th. And so finally, the IPCC has really outlined that having global emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2050 is the best shot that we have at limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 C. And the window is closing quickly, but it's not out of reach. We do need immediate near-term action paired with long-term solutions that reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the next 20 to 30 years. This is where the private sector comes in. Companies are really quickly understanding that their time to act is running out and that science-based targets are the best way to align with the climate science. The private sector must work together with their suppliers, customers, peers, investors, wider society to develop innovative strategies to make sure this transformative change towards a just and fair decarbonized future starts today. And so taking climate action today means ensuring a better tomorrow, and it starts with understanding how much and how quickly we need to reduce emissions. Thank you so much.
All right, so we're all here. I'm going to quickly introduce our distinguished speakers. First, we have Lauren Burst-Moss, Senior VP and Chief Sustainability Officer of Vornado Realty Trust. Nico Kienzl, Director of Atelier 10. And Jamie Statter, Senior Advisor for Climate for the Office of the Comptroller, Brad Lander, who we'll hear from later today. So if I could ask each of you to give a brief introduction and also to talk a little bit about your connection to science-based targets and net zero. Why don't we start with Jamie, since you're here and we just heard from Paulina. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me today, and it's good to see so many people here. As you just heard, I am the senior advisor in Brad Lander's office, specifically within the Bureau of Asset Management. So on the team that serves as the investment advisor to the New York City pension funds. 3 of the 5 New York City pension funds have stated a commitment to achieve net zero by 2040. that they made in 2021. The trustees of those funds saw that as a critical component of their fiduciary duty. And in the last several months, we were very proud to put forth a very robust implementation plan for that commitment. And we believe it's one of the most robust plans that exist in the world, but definitely in the country. We have a science-based target component to that. So in our investment portfolio on the public equity side, so public companies in which we are invested, we have set the goal of having 70% of our financed emissions within those three funds covered by science-based targets within the next 2 years. So by June 30th, 2025, so almost exactly 2 years. And that will raise to 90% by the end of the decade. So we're really thinking about asking our portfolio companies to manage their own emissions through this process as a starting point to hitting that net zero goal while we are also reducing emissions. And I'll talk more about that as we go through it, but that's a very brief overview.
No, it's helpful. Thank you. Lauren?
Thank you. Nice to be here. It's great to see so many people out. So at Vornado Realty Trust, we are a public REIT. We have about 34 million square feet of commercial office space. About 27 million of it is in and around New York City. We have a public commitment to carbon neutrality. We call it Vision 2030. It is a goal that we will be carbon neutral in our portfolio by 2030, and we define carbon neutral. I think we're going to talk a lot about definitions, but to us, carbon neutrality encompasses our tenant load. So we are a commercial owner. Many of you work in building sciences. You know that as the owner of the building, we don't drive the majority of emissions, but we also purchase our tenants' energy. About 95% of our tenants are submetered. So we include tenant energy and emissions in our carbon neutrality goal, which makes it a much higher bar to meet. But we have agreed to a 50% reduction in consumption in our buildings by 2030 against a 2009 baseline. We also have a science-based target goal. It would fall under the short-term goal, and that is a 64% reduction in energy intensity against a 2019 baseline. And those two goals are aligned so that when we hit 2030, we'll have sort of achieved both a reduction in consumption, recovery of energy, renewable integration into our portfolio, as well as a science-based target. And I would say that the biggest pieces of the puzzle that we're still thinking through are a longer-term net zero goal, as I think Paulina made it very clear, to be very public and to have a very aggressive goal that can withstand a lot of scrutiny. Means we have to be very intentional about what we start to include in net zero. To that, it's nice that Nico's going next because his firm is working with us on creating an embodied carbon framework, which we're very excited about, and how we then integrate that into the longer term goals that we put together.
I can go next. So I'm Nico Kienzl with Atelier 10. Atelier 10 is an international environmental design and engineering firm. We started around 30 years ago in the UK and have now around 350 people globally in 11 offices spanning the world. We are in this unique position that so when organizations set the science-based targets or the climate targets, then the next question is, so what now? What we're gonna do with our buildings, how this is gonna affect new build or our portfolios. And our role is to try to quantify this and provide tools and frameworks and design advice on new construction or existing buildings for major renovations to help implement this. And it's been an interesting journey to see a world where, and I think it's very encouraging, it's where when I started here in New York 20 years ago, the question was like, how do I get a LEED rating, to now a ever accelerating both corporate and regulatory environment where really the industry has fundamentally changed. And we are now looking at actually, I think, beyond net zero to absolute zero. Like what does it take to actually drive our emissions really down, not just kind of like balancing them out as a net exercise. And that conversation has greatly expanded from long-term, from where it started out when we were predominantly worried about energy cost to then carbon emissions, and then now more and more the question about the embodied emissions in construction, beyond, and so far beyond the original question about just how do we make buildings more operationally efficient.
Thank you. So we just heard from Paulina about the Science-Based Target Initiative and how they establish standards for net zero and other. We also can see how complicated and technical it is to do that in the right way. Given that, Lauren, I'd like to hear what is the motivation for large companies like Vornado to go ahead and pursue such ambitious targets?
Sure. I mean, I think what we see in the market is, Vornado has Class A office buildings. That means we have a goal of 100% LEED certification of our in-service office. LEED is an indicator of something, right? And it's an indicator that we run our buildings in a certain way. But what we also know is that we've spent a long time making sure our buildings run properly. We've been reporting on it for years, over 12 years. And what we know is that the market demands that. And by the market, I mean the investment community, but also the tenants. So when we look to think about what kind of tenants that are going to want to come into our buildings, these are tenants that have their own goals, right? And therefore our building goals, our own organization goals, and how we run the buildings has to align with their goals. We also see, I speak to the majority of our investors every year specifically about our ESG goals because they're wanting to understand and validate the work that we do. I think I get up and speak a lot, and we say a lot of the same things that all of my peers and I, but it's very intentional, right? We say things that we know can be backed up because of the communities that we're working with, right? Whether it's the investment community or the tenant community. And that's what drives fundamentally the work that we're doing is we want people in our buildings, and how do we get those people in there? And that drives ESG a lot.
Jamie, I'd like to hear from you about the motivation in focusing on science-based targets from a comptroller perspective, pension fund perspective.
Sure. Well, as the trustees set the net zero goals, it became quite clear that achieving that requires a really dedicated focus. And as I said, these implementation plans that we put forth on behalf of the trustees or that they validated in the last several months are very much a roadmap to get there. When we're thinking about our public portfolio, and again, these are publicly traded companies, and we're looking at the highest emitters, the highest financed emissions, it was very clear that there are a lot of those companies that claim that they are going to be net zero. And you've alluded to this in your remarks, that there's a lot of website announcements, a lot of PR related announcements. And then when we actually, ask these companies as one of their long-term investors for a plan, those are fewer. So it became clear to us that there needed to be an interim step of saying, what are your targets? And as you'll likely hear from my boss, Brad, when he speaks just after us, he's very intent on saying, show us your work. And it was very clear to us that SBTI provided a pathway to ask companies to show us their work. So right now, I just looked at this, we have about 9% of our public portfolio that currently has validated science-based targets. Alternatively, when you look at the portfolio in terms of public net zero commitments, it's more like 80%. So when we're thinking about how we get to reality here, it was a very important interim step for us. Now, as you heard me say at the start, we set this goal to get 70% of our finance emissions covered by science-based targets. So we have a long way to go in just 2 years. So are looking for others to join in this effort. And we have indicated that we're not exclusive to Science-Based Target Initiative as the validator, although we haven't yet heard a proposal on others that would be able to validate that. If certain industries come to us and say, well, SBTI's guidance doesn't work for us. We've heard from some of our steel companies, for example, that their particular process doesn't fit with the guidance as established or as will be established, because I know that's in development. We say, propose something to us. We are very reasonable on this. Propose something that is rigorous. It's a third-party standard and third-party validated. So much in align with how LEED originally developed, that we're looking at a third-party standard with independent validation.
Thank you. So John touched on this in the beginning, that not all net zero claims are the same, which gives a lot of weight to science-based targets. And Paulina, I'd like to hear from you with regarding to the mechanisms that are built in within the SBTI initiative, and how does that give confidence to those setting standards and those and all the stakeholders to avoid greenwashing claims?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, sure, this is okay. Great. So the standard is scientifically robust. We do use credible scientific sources. We're using IEA, IPC standard reports to translate these pathways, looking at these in a lens, using also making sure that they're compatible with the Sustainable Development Goals, to then create this carbon budget broken down to companies and by sectors. We also do have really robust stakeholder processes, so we engage a very diverse set of stakeholders throughout our entire process. We have an expert advisory group for each project. So for the buildings project, we have an expert advisory group convening currently, and then we have public consultations like we have right now, and continue to do lots of targeted engagement to make sure we're getting the feedback and the input from from academia, private sector, et cetera, to make sure that these work in practice. We also work with very closely with a lot of partners. So specifically for the buildings project, we work with Ramble for our developing embodied emission pathways, for developing 1.5 degree aligned in-use operational pathways. We work with CREM, and we're also developing these tools, et cetera. So consistently speaking with others in the area. And so I think these are really what sets the science-based targets apart, making sure that it's really rooted and grounded in the science, and that we're incorporating as much of the practical and real-world feedback as much as possible. And I actually think that your stat about just 9% of your portfolio being within science-based targets is really interesting, that 80% is just net zero, or around. But it's actually quite indicative of like a global level as well, because if you look at global net zero claims, it covers something around 80% of global GDP and the population and emissions. It's a lot. And then, we have 5,000 companies in the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So it's a very, it's growing quite quickly, but that's why we really need to have this like comparison and base to make sure that we can cut through the noise of the really huge amount of these commitments. Yeah.
It's also a very simple ask from an investor perspective. It gives us a very clear thing to ask every single one of our portfolio companies, that is a good starting point for us as we embark on this several decade journey to get to net zero.
Thank you. Nico, so you have taking the kind of a step back out of New York City here, you have a global view through your customers. So what are you seeing outside New York, the US, in how large real estate developers and other are approaching decarbonization in their buildings?
Well, I think there's definitely a lot of momentum, and it's what everybody talks about, but it's messy out there, right, globally. There's a quite wide variety in sectors and in regions where things are quite different. I do think clearly the target market for science-based target initiatives, like the big investors, the big companies, they all have ESG reports. They all have started to, at varying degrees of detail, assess what their carbon emissions are in the process of develop their targets, their glide paths, and so on. There's still a wide variety of what metrics they use and how rigorous they are and how they drive the boundaries. And there's actually quite a lot of reporting that happens that's different for different companies or stakeholder groups. And so I think that kind of like finding a global standard, global alignment would help that, but we're not there yet. And actually, we know that even real estate firms that have multiple different investors, international investors, report against different metrics, and there's quite a big overhead in reporting about just to your community. But I think the large corporate world clearly is addressing this because the markets demand it. like it's the investor markets demand it. It's seen as part of their kind of like risk profile that this is getting addressed. And the corporate real estate market that is either large, kind of like a large corporation themselves or that caters to these large companies is responding very, very rapidly. And so we see in places like Australia and the UK and the US, in these developed markets, developers are really aggressively pushing either to develop net zero new buildings, all electric buildings. The zero carbon is really in many places now becoming the standard for new Class A development because the market demands it and the developers don't want stranded assets. I think that's really the big fear, that you do have stranded assets because if you think about how long it takes to design a new building and so on, you're talking 5 years down the road. And that's the big driver. And just mitigating that risk is worth a lot of money. I do think the existing building market is quite different, and I think people are struggling with the economics of that. And I think New York City with Local Law 97 is still unique in how aggressive it set a target and incentive for the existing market. In a lot of other places, that is not as strong a driver. And so people do look, again, the big players have audited their portfolios, are starting to develop plans, are looking at how they upgrade and how they fold this into their large targets. And I do think we see quite big regional differences what the drivers are. In many parts of the world, decarbonizing a building is really all about what is your energy, where's your electricity coming from? Because we are so used to talking here about how do we get natural gas out of buildings. There's many parts of the world where natural gas is not in buildings, like Australia, Singapore, and so on. These are all electric buildings because the heating loads are not there. So a lot of them has to do just like how do you drive efficiency and how fast can your grid decarbonize? And again, the regional differences, they're big. We also see, I think what's true is, what's here in the US is you see a lot of initiative at the city and state level. And there's very few kind of like federal or national commitments. Even in the UK, London is very different than Manchester, right? London is like the targets for big developers in London because that's where the Class A client is. It's like they're driving hard for their own set of metrics. It's 55 kilowatt hours per square meter energy target, all electric. It's an embodied carbon target that's coming out some RIBA guidelines. That's what the market is looking for. You go to Manchester, it's a much more relaxed kind of like target setting, but it's moving in the right direction. So it's messy out there. I think we must probably have another 4 or 5 years of messy collaboration through all of this until we have robust enough global agreements on standards. And I think one of the worst the messiest parts is the embodied energy side, where here in the US, we're primarily looking at structure and facades. In the UK, they're already starting to report on full embodied energy of all the systems, and the supply chain information is just very weak. And it's like whether you say your building's 400 or 600 kilograms a square meter in terms of embodied carbon new build, it's probably more to do with who does your calculation than how good your supply chain is. It's just, there's a lot still to be done there.
Yes, I'm well aware. Being a sustainability person at a big company, yes, I am well aware of the data issue. So, Lauren, on that point, can you talk a little bit about the challenges that you've encountered on your path for science-based targets and kind of, how can any ideas on how we can address that?
Sure. What I would say is I think data is really critical. I think understanding your portfolio is very important. Every building is unique. I heard somebody say years and years ago, every building is a snowflake, and you sort of go, oh, really? But then you realize it is, because it depends on not just the structure or the mechanical equipment, but also the tenant, who's using the building and how they're using it. We are very dependent on the grid. In New York, we just experienced, if you look at all of the reporting that's coming out around very heavy New York City owners, all of our location-based emissions just tanked because our grid got dirtier, because they took nuclear off and added natural gas in. So I have a challenge of now explaining not just to the people above me at Vornado, but to the investment community, why my numbers look so poor this year. And I think, so we are dependent upon the grid for where our electricity comes from. We are really committed to helping Con Ed green the STEAM system, which I keep saying, because if I keep saying it, then it will happen, which we believe, and we run a lot of STEAM in our buildings. But we do spend a huge amount of time looking at the data and thinking about how for every building we can get there. And one of the things I think I say a lot is, 97 is in many ways makes it easier in New York. We are very lucky in New York City because we have access to the data, which is much harder, we were talking about, when you're outside of New York to get access to the data around your buildings. We have that. We submeter 95% of our tenants, so we can see who the best performers are and where we have opportunity. And that's, so tenant engagement, I would say tenant engagement is one of my biggest opportunities. I don't know if I want to say that it's just, we find that tenants go into their space with the best of intentions and then don't relook at their spaces. And we need them in this journey to carbon neutrality to come along with us. And so I think tenant engagement is a big deal, but looking at your data and understanding how your building works and what opportunities are there is really important.
So now we're going to transition over to audience questions. I have them here. So if you haven't submitted and you want to, please go ahead and do that. The first one I have here is recent policies have advanced operations for decarbonization of buildings. What policies should exist to impact embodied carbon? Who wants to take that one?
I'll start and then Nico should chime in. I think the data around all of this equipment is really hard. So steel and concrete, we have data, right? So one of the interesting things we've been trying to work on and think through is Vornado, as a developer, we are not a huge ground up construction developer. We are very focused on redevelopment. You've probably all seen the Penn District. I promise it's going to be beautiful. Probably by the end of the year, it's actually already looking awesome. But then we think about what we do in our buildings every day, right? We renovate lobbies, we renovate hallways, we bring in new equipment, lighting. We don't know what the embodied carbon is in that kind of project. And in order to truly get to a net zero claim, we need to be able to understand that. So I think it is up to the suppliers, the manufacturers. We're gonna need the manufacturers to come along in order for us to truly be able to state any embodied carbon goals.
And what I'll share from that perspective is that it's as this, again, from my seat in a sustainability role in an OEM, having the voice of the customer is very powerful, because just me saying we need to do LCAs, the EPDs are coming. It's like I'm Cassandra and this, the sky's falling, all of that. But having the voice of the customer, and it's becoming a chorus now, is really driving that for companies like us.
I mean, I think I'm not sure what policy needs to be there, but I think an interesting case study is what's currently happening in London in particular, where the focus on embodied energy is really, really heightened. And so the developer community is hyper-focused, and it's like, and for example, British Land, which is one of the biggest property owners in London, they've set a target of 500 kilograms of carbon emissions per square foot of new construction, and it's tied to the bonus of their board. So they're aggressively reporting at every board meeting what's the emissions of their new construction, because otherwise the board members don't get their bonus. And so the supply chain competes on carbon numbers as much as on cost, which is really transformational on the new build. The other side of that is that in the UK, or in London in particular, the planning boards don't approve new planning schemes that require tear down if you haven't explored to the max what you could do with the reuse. And so like they're just blocking new development if it's a tear down. And they make the developers jump really through hoops to figure out how much of existing structures can be saved. And if that's the driver, people get very creative. And I think it actually creates a real opportunity to look at adaptive reuse in much, much more interesting ways. But it is also means that you then need to have a market that wants these buildings, right? The developers still need to rent these buildings out. And so there's, I think in the design community, there's a big question about how do you do this in a creative way? I know we've done a lot with Vornado, not only in the Penn District, but Moynihan Station. We've just worked on 550 Madison as a reposition of 550 Madison. There's the amount of carbon you're avoiding by repurposing building, even with just the main structure and foundation systems, is just massive. And I think London is just kind of like a canary in the coal mine, where I think we see a lot of communities that are just going to say, well, you're not going to take this building down because you're not going to get a permit for a new build.
I was not surprised to see this question because we heard nuclear mentioned earlier today. So did the speakers today consider nuclear power as an important way to meet the increased electricity demand to achieve net zero emissions? How does science-based targets consider nuclear?
Well, we're like technology agnostic. So again, it would just really be based on the emissions of
themselves. Yep.
the actual energy produced. So yeah, that's as far as we could go. You know, it's really just the oil and gas component is where we, don't really have much flexibility.
I would say the same is true for us in that we're very much looking at this from a financial performance perspective as fiduciaries. And so managing risk to the portfolio is our motivation across the board. And we haven't considered nuclear in that context because we're looking very much at an emissions perspective. That said, there is nuclear considerations as fiduciaries in other contexts, which I don't need to get into.
Okay. Do you want to go ahead?
I'll
and add?
chime
Yeah.
in on that.
Go ahead.
I think because I brought it up. I would say I think the hard part for us was looking at what happened to the grid when nuclear was taken down, because it's a challenge when you have policies that don't align. And I think that's actually what happened in New York State. There was an agreement to take nuclear offline because of some of the concerns around having nuclear plant. I'm not going to debate those, but at the same time, the grid was clearly not ready. And what that meant was bringing in non-renewable resource. I sit on the board of the New York Energy Consumer Council. We are very active and involved in these discussions. And I think, our biggest concern consistently is reliability and availability. And so to have a conversation around, is nuclear part of the solution? I think nothing should be off the table. But I think that the biggest concern as an owner of large buildings, as John said before, buildings are the refuge. We need the buildings to run. The grid needs to be there for us. And with a push towards electrification, there's a lot of concerns around, can buildings be a refuge? And those are the kinds of considerations. It's a different kind of panel than net zero, but I think it's an important discussion when we all push towards these solutions to decarbonize.
Okay. This one was voted up. How should reporting companies obtain data from more reluctant landlords of offices to report and share their data, their building data, and refrigerant leakage? I'm looking at you, Lauren, because I feel like you're the one here who can answer that.
Refrigerant leakage is real and true, and something we're all trying to figure out how we account for. I would say it's a little still not defined as to the best method of accounting for it, calculating it. tracking it. It's still in its infancy, at least in the Vornado portfolio, but it is something that we are trying to understand and look at all the refrigerants in all of our building systems and understand where we have leakage and what that means in terms of the transitions to new equipment, and if that's better or worse. And I think the second part around how data, I mean, again, in New York City, you can go on Building Energy Exchange's website and run my 97 numbers, which I think many of the providers do, and then call me and say, I have a problem at a building. So we have no issue with the data being public here. All 84 data is public. So, you know, I think in other parts of the country, maybe it's a different concern, but here my data is public, so you can go look at it if you want.
Just to jump in on this, I do think that the refrigerant question is a really interesting one, because I think there's a huge misconception that if we just electrify everything, no matter what, it's a great thing. And if we end up with kind of like loads of refrigerant in kind of decentralized systems, I'm actually not so sure we're that much better off. And I do think there's still a lot of technology change that needs to happen to figure out what's the right balance there, where we centralize equipment. I'm still looking for somebody who goes in the business with me to do small scale steam heat pumps, because I don't think we're going to get steam out of the residential portfolio anytime soon. And I do think I do worry about Con Ed's green steam program, whether that has legs long term. But I do think there's so much innovation still needs to be done, and the solution will not be, I think, long term, to follow a model that we're seeing already in Asia, where every unit has a little mini split, or like farms of VRF systems with like massive amounts of refrigerants. I do think there need to be better ways.
Okay. There is a technical question here regarding establishing science-based targets. In terms of establishing the baseline year, could you provide a little color on that, and how, or maybe even Lauren, since you've had to go through the process of establishing a baseline year, and what goes into that thought process?
I mean, I can just give a little bit of
Okay.
background, and then you can go into how you choose one more. But I mean, at SBTI, we require that the baseline year is after 2015. So there is some flexibility for a company to choose a year that is, well, it should be as representative of your organization's operations as possible that specific year, and you know, where you really have a lot of data availability. So I think that's kind of where you want to start. And you know, if you choose a baseline year that is later on, and this is getting very technical, after 2020, there are some adjustments to make to ensure that the reductions are still the same as it would be if it were a baseline, a target that has a baseline year earlier between 2015 and 2020.
So we had 2019, which is a representative year of Vornado, and when it was worked on, it was during a time when it wasn't as representative. But 2019 for us was a full year of typical, at that point, typical utilization in our buildings, and we had full data on occupancy and consumption, usage, et cetera. So for us, that was a really easy. It is not easy to do SBTI, but that was an easy choice in there.
Thank you. We have a few questions regarding Scope 3 emissions. So we talked a lot about embodied carbon, but there are other Scope 3 emissions. And so how do you consider these in your targets? And I think to answer this question, we need to take a step back and talk about the scope in terms of how, like, because I know the answer, but when you look at establishing Scope 3 targets, like, what triggers that and what is the threshold?
Yeah, so Scope 3 is definitely included in science-based targets because, as we're all aware, it is really the vast amount of an emissions profile of a company. I mean, I think usually it's around 11 times more than the rest of the emissions. And so at SBTI, we follow what we call like an expansive boundary approach, because we recognize that it's also the most challenging part for companies to address because of lack of data availability, ways to measure that data, and tools to tap into that. We want to provide some time to allow for collaboration across your supply chain, within your value chain, et cetera, to make sure that, we're working within the industry as a whole to tackle these emissions. But yes, so in the near term, if your company's emissions profile is 40% or more from scope 3, you need to reduce that scope 3 by 67% or more. In the long term, that increases, which is what I was saying with the expansive boundary approach. It increases to all your scope 3 needs to be addressed and needs to be reduced by 90%. And again, that kind of provides some time for development and improvements in those things I was just saying to have companies catch up, but still make sure that all emissions are tackled.
I can talk a little
Yeah,
bit.
go ahead.
On our end, setting our own targets for the net zero funds, we have set targets for scopes 1 and 2, interim targets. We have set for NYCers in particular, set 32% reduction by 2025. Let me just look at this, 59% by 2030 to net zero by 2040. We are holding off on setting scope 3 targets because of the data availability question. We just started collecting that data, so we expect to set it, if not next year, the year following, for those interim and then longer term targets. As shareholders in the public markets, our advocacy is starting, however, or has been ongoing. We've been working to accelerate reporting and target setting in the banks, the big banks in particular, around their financed emissions. We had filed some shareholder proposals this last year around asking 4 of the largest banks to set absolute emissions reduction targets as opposed to just intensity targets to really get a grasp on what's going on there. And we'll be continuing to look at how we can best, as a shareholder, approach that question.
The majority of scope 3 for you is it embodied carbon, right?
It's the tenant emissions, but we push them into scope 2. So we didn't have to include scope 3 in our SBTI target because we didn't hit that 40% threshold, because our biggest emissions are our tenants. We love them. But we take responsibility for their emissions, and that meant that we didn't hit the 40% threshold, which has created an opportunity for us, to do the embodied carbon framework and think through how we would then integrate a longer term plan. But we were talking about this before. The question always comes up to, will the SEC define scope 1 and scope 2 differently? And if they define it differently, does that push us into a scope 3? And then we have to realign all of our goals. And these are the things that we think about when we put together this puzzle. But right now, we feel very comfortable with the scope 1 and scope 2 targets that we have, which we feel are very inclusive of and representative of the work that we do as owners.
Okay, so let's see. How do you get Class B, C, or smaller institutions more involved to join the climate movement? It's a tough one.
That was a question for Doreen.
Yeah, that was it. All right, so.
I mean, I do think that is, I'm going to attempt it. I do think it's really challenging. I do think that for a lot of smaller building owners or tenants, or not Class A buildings or Class A institutions, the economics are really challenging. And I do think I think what we're seeing is like in everything we've seen over the last 20 years or 30 years in this space, there's a kind of a carrot and a stick, right? There's the carrot that leads the field in one direction. And so I do think a lot of the ESG and because that's fundamental, it's not a requirement, but it is what makes you more attractive to your investors. It might become a requirement through SEC rules, but it moves the market in a certain direction, can be quite powerful, and has led the way instead of market sentiment and market expectations. I do think the only way to get the B and C people to move is through the stick, which is codes and regulatory change. And I think we're seeing these things where gas bans, things like that, are going to drive the market. And I think there will be really significant conversation about hardships and kind of like incentives payments and what that does mean economically. But it is, I think it's this duality of kind of like setting a market, a change in market expectation that still has value for the B and C market, because it says that if you want to be seen as still a decent landlord, at least you have to do something, and need to start being at least conversant about these issues.
I think that's right. You touched on this, Nico, before about the opportunity with redevelopment, and we have a few questions coming in on that point. So how can New York developers and other government agencies be persuaded that redevelopment of existing buildings is a good investment as opposed to developing a new Class A building?
I mean, I do think a lot of it has to do with education. And I think one of the, I mean, we've been working on a project, shall not be named, a couple of years ago, where it's a classic situation. The developer put out a competition to a number of architects to come up with a proposal, and the competition brief was do a rebuild of this tower. So basically, take the building out, start with a blank slate, and move forward. And we brought it up and said, like, why don't we do a rebuild, like repurpose the existing building? There's a lot we can do, and it was felt by the competing teams that the owner had already made the decision to rebuild, and to kind of like take the risk of come up with a totally different approach risks you not winning the project. And so you really need to get ahead of that entire decision tree and need to start educating developers what the opportunities are, what the benefits are. I think that's a huge part of it, is to get the brokers involved of what the market wants. I mean, it's amazing to me often how much the brokers still drive. And often their level of understanding of what the technical issues are, what the market wants, is still often shockingly low. And so I do think there's a lot that can be done bringing this along. And I think about some of it is case studies, and we see wonderful buildings in the city that have had radical retrofits and turned out into amazing buildings. I think there's lots of examples in Europe where the repurposing of existing structures has been a much bigger thing for a longer period of time. And so I think a lot of it is educating the market. And then again, you could go back to the stick side as we see it in London, where you just start with holding planning, or kind of putting regulatory constraints on things as well. But I do think I've actually taught a class at Columbia for a couple of years that looked at reusing existing buildings. No matter which way you do the math, if you only try to repurpose an existing building on the energy cost savings, you're not getting very far. And so it has to be this value add proposition about building something that is better than what it was before, which allows you to change your rent profile, change your performance of your building, and that then really unlocks the kind of like the existing building market.
All right, so we have 1 minute left, so we're going to do this really fast. You heard in the mandate, we have to be net zero by 2050, decarbonize buildings. You have a couple seconds. What do we do? Here we go. Last words for the panel. Yeah. Go ahead.
So, I mean, I think one of the things that we like to talk about at SBTI is really ensuring that there is collaboration happening across different types of stakeholders. I mean, we're really only going to be solving this if we're looking at every single piece of the stakeholder and different people involved, different types of, I mean, if we're talking about buildings, from the architects to the management companies to everything. But then also looking across your supply chains, looking across to, who may be your competitor, and seeing what they're doing, how can you work together to reduce the emissions, because it's not possible to do it really alone.
Yeah, so collaboration, one word, come on, we're way over now.
I would say deliberative, be deliberative.
Okay.
I think it is intentional and relationship driven.
I think it's the grid. I think we need we need reliable transformation of the grid that really is going to happen.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right, panel's going to take a quick picture here. Excellent. Okay, we have a very, very, very special guest. Everybody leaving the room, you're not going to want to miss our special guest. We have a great special guest to close the panel today. As you heard on the panel discussion, one of the very, very strongest supporters of net zero in New York City is our Comptroller, Brad Lander. Comptroller Lander has been a champion of sustainability for years, dating back to his days on the New York City Council, where we worked with him on many issues. He's now taken it to a brand new level with the city's $240 billion pension fund, directing investment portfolios to reach net zero emissions by 2040. We're really, really honored that he's joined us today to help close out this part of our conference. So please welcome Comptroller Brad Lander.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It is really nice to be here. It's great to see so many of you here. Obviously, we got a smoke signal this week about the urgency of the climate crisis. And one we really need to take seriously. And that of course means helping people know how to respond to it and paying attention to respiratory health. But it also means that as the air clears up over the next few days, that we just not do that human thing of going back to business as normal. This is a sign of the urgency of the climate crisis. It is of course the case that the air quality is like this in Delhi and Dhaka on a daily basis, and that a little taste of it here is terrible. But if it wakes us up, and let's be very clear in what we need to remind people, yes, like what's causing these this smoke are wildfires in Canada. What's causing the wildfires in Canada is a warming planet caused by burning fossil fuels. And if we don't want to live in a world where this is our regular reality, then it is on us right now, not just to get more ready for future crises. It's worth noticing we weren't ready for this one. The mayor said we didn't have a playbook. We weren't ready for Hurricane Ida either. We were paying attention to coastal flooding and not flash flooding. That is what the climate crisis looks like. It looks like emergencies that are very challenging to adapt to. We do have to do a lot more work on adaptation, but now we have to triple, quadruple, and more our work on mitigation. This is the moment when we can keep warming down through the exact steps that you are talking about here. So I appreciate that you all came today and that you invited me. I'm a longtime fan of Urban Green Council, and I do have to give a shout out to my dear friend Ellen Honigstock, who introduced me to Urban Green Council, 12-ish years ago. And I've been so proud to work closely with you on so many things. Back in my old city council district, trying to get rooftop solar on every single home we could. I'll come back to that in a minute. And especially in partnering on Local Law 97. Let's hear it for everybody in the room who has done the work to make Local Law 97 a reality and is now doing the work to stand it up. I'm not going to focus on that, but it is so critical. The law is such a powerful one. You got to be bold in a situation like this, and then get to work in an intentional and deliberate way, getting the details right and making it possible to implement without saying, oh, this is too hard, there's too many challenges. So I really want to appreciate, I think the creative tension between ambitious goals and the challenge of transformation is exactly the healthy dynamic we want to have. And I respect people pushing to say we need to think about this or that way of doing it, but I really am glad, and we're going to keep pushing to make sure that the administration does everything it can to have fidelity to that law. We should be so proud to be in the city that is moving most aggressively to get our buildings retrofit for energy efficiency. So thanks to everybody in the room who made that happen. Big thanks to Urban Green Council. Before I get back to the pension funds, I want to talk briefly about this very exciting program that the mayor and I announced about a month ago called Public Solar NYC. Prompted by Ellen and others of you, I went and got rooftop solar on my row house in Brooklyn, and I'm delighted to have it. Brooklyn Solar Works did a great job of helping me get the tax credits and install it and work with NYSERDA. But I will tell you, we are not going to scale rooftop solar, even with new IRA subsidies, with the model we currently have, where every homeowner has to come out of pocket a few $1,000s and act like a mini developer. Not only will it not get to low and moderate income communities, we won't even scale it in communities where people have resources and care about the environment. And our roofs, especially because most of our buildings are 1 to 4 family homes, are the biggest renewable energy resource we have in New York City, and we can tap it. And so the model that the mayor and I put forward and are going to be doing a pilot round on is to have the city get some money from the federal government, mix it together with some money from the city, go and knock on your door and say, the city of New York would love to put solar panels on your roof. We will finance, permit, install, own, and asset manage those panels. You don't have to come out of pocket. You don't have to deal with the paperwork. You sign a lease for your roof, and we will handle all the other parts of it, and we'll share the energy benefits with you. We think it's a great model. Obviously, there are private sector actors doing something like that, but there's no reason public sector actors like the city can't do it. The financing is extremely attractive. We think it's going to work. So we're applying to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund when it opens this summer to do a 3,000 home pilot round. And after that works, Kenohora, we want to scale it up and do tens and hopefully hundreds of thousands of homes. So we're really excited to partner with those of you who know a lot about this to make it a success. It also has great opportunities for good green jobs, since we will be saying to installers, we're going to get you a ton of work so we can help low and moderate income homeowners. We can scale up rooftop solar at an enormous way, and we can create the good green jobs of the future right here and now. Really excited to work with you on that. And you heard from Jamie about so much of what we're doing, but I really do want to underline it, because I think if we in the New York City Comptroller's office can have a meaningful impact, this is the place it is going to be. The $256 billion, up from $240 billion, so this strategy can even be good for you. It represents the retirement security of teachers and firefighters, school crossing guards and secretaries. And it's an obligation that already runs out basically to the end of this century. Think about a first-year teacher this year who started teaching, is almost done with his or her first year in the classroom. Hopefully they'll teach another 30 years and then retire and live another 40 years after that. So the pension obligations we have to them run out decades, basically to the end of the century already. And if you are responsible, as we are in our office, for the retirement security of folks decades out, it is so straightforward that climate risk is one of the biggest financial risks that you face, and that you can't possibly meet your obligations unless you're mindful to it. So those red state AGs and treasurers who say all you should focus on is last year's profits, like did you make money on oil stocks when Russia invaded Ukraine, without regard for the fact that if we don't meet our targets and hold warming below 1.5 or at least 2 degrees Celsius, not only will we have many more days of smoke-filled cities, not only will we have tens of millions of climate refugees, we will also burn up trillions of dollars in our portfolio. A planet with 2.5 or 3 degrees of warming is a dramatically poorer planet than a planet that keeps warming below 1.5 or at least 2 degrees Celsius. It really is just that simple. That is wise long-term investing. And that is why 3 of the 5 New York City pension funds have become the most ambitious and bold leaders on net zero implementation, putting out the plan that Jamie talked about, building on prior decisions to divest the public equities from fossil fuel reserve owners, and now moving forward to say to all of our asset managers and partners, we are aiming for net zero by 2040. We cannot possibly do that unless we have an aligned partnership with all of our asset and investment managers, from the biggest in the world, BlackRock, with about $10 trillion under management, including about $60 billion of the retirees of the city of New York, to our hundreds of investment managers in real estate and infrastructure and private credit. And we need from all of them the plan that we are committing to. A really clear net zero plan with a deadline, a commitment to disclose your emissions every year until you get there. And yes, we're going to disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. Setting targets on Scope 3 is harder, and we want to be partners with all of you. And then, in addition to disclosing with all of the companies in your portfolio, whether you're in private or public markets, you need to say to your portfolio companies, you have to set science-based targets, and we want to see your plan for decarbonizing. And that's why I think the work you are doing, lifting up what science-based targets are and how we look at them, we are going to be working with SBTI, but we're open to other approaches and measurements. You just have to show your work. It's got to be real. We do think Scope 3 is critical here. So many companies that are our portfolio companies' main and material emissions come from their Scope 3 emissions. So we're the lead investor with Climate Action 100 at Ford and General Motors. And actually, we've done substantial engagement recently with Toyota. I don't know if you saw, but last week we voted against the board chair there because we don't feel that they're taking independent shareholders' concerns seriously. But think about a car company, you know, like where are its emissions are when its customers drive it around. But those are Scope 3 emissions. So if we're not going to count them, we really aren't going to have a serious net zero approach. There are so many opportunities here. We're going to dramatically scale up our climate solutions investments. But I do want to be clear, we're not talking about offsets, like we're going to invest in renewable technology, invest in building transformation, invest in solutions to the climate crisis, and those will grow in value tremendously. We'll be open to people who pitch us investing in sequestration or other technologies, and we'll be delighted to see those work, but our challenge will be to each one of our asset managers across all our asset classes to join us in setting those goals, in disclosing every year, in reporting financed emissions across their portfolio, and in setting science-based targets for the companies in their portfolio on the timescale required by Paris and required by the planet. The last thing I'll say is we will not be able to achieve those goals on our own. No one is going to construct a portfolio or pick stocks that get you to net zero on your own. You can't portfolio craft a $250 billion portfolio. We need to be working together with a broad, high-ambition coalition of public sector pension funds, of large institutional investors who see the landscape the same way we see it, who have long-term obligations, who know it is possible to achieve decarbonization on the timescale that we need. We couldn't actually take that for granted 5 even years ago, but we can do it now. The cost, if we don't, will be borne in lives and in dollars. So if you know other pension fund folks I could talk to, I'm reaching out across to treasurers of other states and cities, talking not just in the US, but to European, who are far ahead of us in many cases, Canadian and other investors. We'd like to work with you to get measurement right, to think about how we set those science-based targets. I'm sure there are some mistakes in our plan. We want to be pushed on them and iterate forward. What will make it possible for us to succeed is if smart people all aligned are really working hard together. We do have the resources that we need and the clarity that we need through both government action and through investor action and through the action of people who are most engaged in doing the work on a day-to-day basis to decarbonize and achieve the climate transition on a timeline that will make an enormous difference to the retirement portfolios of New York City public sector workers and everyone else on the planet. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. We're delighted to be your partners.
We had a break literally in 1 minute, but before we do that, I just wanted to thank again our lead sponsor, Carrier, and we have a very, very short video to show you right now.